Well, it's not very often I get to have a friend on the show that goes way back. I mean, there's some history that I have with this friend that I can't wait to introduce you to. And first, I got to say, this person got me into Christian music. Really. I really have to say that. I have John J Thompson on the phone. He's like a brother because I think we go back like 30-something years, John.
Yeah, 30-something. We'll just leave it at that. We won't fill in the blank there. It's good to talk to you, Weez.
It's so good to talk to you, John. But yeah, you got me into Christian music. Remember, I heard an Amy Grant song on a radio. It changed my life. I didn't realize there was this God that loved me, all from going to an Amy Grant concert. And I remember going to this church that we met at. It was a Bible study then, the Warehouse Church in Aurora. I go there and I learn all about all this Jesus stuff that was happening. And I met Pastor Randy. I met you, John, and you said, "Oh, you think Amy Grant is cool? You need to come to Cornerstone." And I'm like, "Really?" And I remember going to Cornerstone. You're like, "Check out Charlie Peacock, check out this." And I was like, blown away. I'm like, this is so cool. And I was hooked. I was so hooked on Christian music. And I know for me, one song changed my life. Really did. And so I'm very passionate about it. But John, you were a big part of that. So glad to have you on the show.
And then we got to work together. Yeah. Was it Margaret Becker was one of the ones that I remember you being really excited about early on?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember. I kind of knew it. I knew that was going to be a slam dunk.
John, tell them about the store that we worked at that you started, True Tunes.
Yeah, well, I went to the first Cornerstone Festival in 1984. I was 13, almost 14. And when I saw this music that was so good, and I just could not believe that it wasn't more popular than it was. This wasn't your parents' Christian music. This wasn't the stuff that this was like legit, really good music that deserved to be on MTV. It deserved to be talked about in Rolling Stone. It just wasn't. And I was a serious music head. Like I was obsessed with music and a very broad palette of music. I loved old-time blues, and I liked old Americana, what they later called Americana, like old Johnny Cash and Hank and old country stuff. I loved Dylan and folk stuff. I liked hard rock music. I liked even really good pop music. I liked a lot of kinds of music. But Christian music that I had heard up until that point had been like, almost like, we were very poor when I was a kid. And, when we wanted really good jeans, my mom had to go to the poor people store and get us kind of poor people jeans. They were never Levi's or Lee's. They were like stiff and, they didn't quite work or fit right. Or like we had Keds shoes. They weren't Nikes or Adidas. They were Keds, and the soles were like hard plastic. And whenever you tried to stop in gym class, you just slid right across the floor. That was what Christian music was like. It was like a poor man's version of real music that they had just taken all of the dangerous words and ideas out of and made it like what you thought a Sunday school lesson would be about. And that wasn't interesting to me. I was living a life that was, in the real world, and it was kind of, my childhood was pretty rough, and I needed music that was asking tough questions and then pointing me towards where I might find some answers as opposed to spoon-feeding me answers. I found it at Cornerstone, and I decided, you know what? I'm going to do whatever I can to introduce more people to this kind of music. And the store was part of that, but I knew that I was going to have a magazine because back then we didn't have the internet, so a magazine was part of that. I knew I was going to have to be able to get bands to play, so at some point I needed a venue. So eventually we had a club. But it took time for all those pieces to come together. But I sat down when I was 14 and I wrote out a sort of manifesto, and I called it True Tunes, and it involved a way for people to hear music, a way for people to see music, a way for people to read about music, a way for people to talk about music, and a way for people to buy music. It was this community centered around music that could change their lives, conversations that could change their lives, friendships that could form around music, and it was all going to happen in this thing. And it was basically inspired by Cornerstone and the music I heard at Cornerstone. So it makes perfect sense. I'd meet you a couple years later and say, you got to jump on this train with me. Everybody's got to jump on this train with me. It's not like I invented the train. I felt like it was something that was happening, and it was part of my calling to get people involved, because God had really met me in that place in a very real way. And I just kind of knew that God wanted to meet everybody in that real way. And some of us just have a hard time hearing from him in a place that feels plastic, and so that's what True Tunes was about. And
Well,
that's what it is about, because it's kind of
Yeah.
back in a different way.
Right. And John, thank you so much, because that really changed my life when you invited me to Cornerstone, and then said, Weez, you got to come work for me. You got to come work at True Tunes. And we really did have this special community. We were exposed to a lot. We were educated about music and what was happening. And I think it was fun to learn God didn't live in this box that we had created with music. There was all these genres that were reaching so many others and still are to this day. So I'm very, very thankful for it. But one thing that you did to me, you brought up Margaret Becker earlier. I don't know if you remember this. You said, hey, Weez, there's somebody on the phone for you. I'm like, oh, okay. I get on the phone and you guys are all laughing. I don't know what's going on. They're like, hi, Weez, how you doing? It's Margaret. I thought it was my sister. And I'm like, yeah, hi. And you're laughing. And I went into fangirl mode. I'm like, wait a minute. Is this Margaret Becker? You guys were laughing.
Oh, my gosh.
I was like, thanks a lot, you guys. Put me on the spot.
That's funny. I don't remember that, but that does sound like something I would have loved to do. And I think that a part of that is that you, and I still am this way, like, we are fans first. And one of the best compliments I ever got was at Cornerstone's 20th year. I put together a massive event at the festival where we had almost, I think, 19 bands. We couldn't quite fit the 20th band in there, but it was 19 bands in 3 hours, 3 different stages all at once on the main stage. And I was the host of that thing, and we had video segments that happened between the bands, and we had testimonials and lots of music. It was just really, really cool. And somebody told me that night, they said, you know what I love about when you're up there and you're hosting and you're speaking up on main stage, and I was constantly talking about how at the first Cornerstone I was just a 13-year-old kid pressed up against the front of the stage, just having my life changed. And he said, I love that when you're up there, you're not cool, like you're not acting like you just look like one of us that somehow snuck backstage and worked your way up onto the stage, which is exactly what had happened. Like and I never tried to present myself as anything other than that. I kind of represent, truthfully, I hope, the fans, and the fact that there really is no barrier between the fans and the artists. All of those barriers were imagined. They're not real. And so the thing about True Tunes was that we knew that stages and backstage and barriers and all that kind of stuff, that was artifice. That was designed to make rock stars, and that was designed to make people seem more impressive than they were. And that was not helping us create community. And so I tried to dismantle that stuff. And that's what I think has happened now with artists, with social media and more artists being independent, is that they have to be more connected to their fans, and sometimes almost too connected. People want to know what kind of cereal they had every morning and all that kind of stuff. But that taking people backstage, both literally, was a lot of fun. But with you in that moment with Margaret, it was like each of us had to have that time where the mystery got popped a little bit, and we started to kind of not fan out too much. But then you don't want to ever lose it completely, because that's also why the audience was so excited to be around us, because they knew that we were just the chief geeks. We were the ones that were the total nerds about this stuff. So I never wanted us to ever become cool.
Right, and that's still all true today. I would say that you're leading the charge. I'm still leading the charge in different spaces and different ways of just loving music and just appreciating everything that music is doing. It's so fun to talk about True Tunes days. And John, you've always been this connoisseur of music. You were like a walking, before there was Wikipedia or Google, we would go to John. We would just go to you because you knew so much about the music, because you spent so much time living and breathing it. And now we get to hear your knowledge and see a little bit of your knowledge on film, if you will, because we got the Jesus Music documentary coming out, and I saw just a snippet of it in June. I saw 30 minutes of it, and wow, I cannot wait. Tell us a little bit, one, how did you get involved with this documentary, and tell us what this documentary is about.
Yeah, well, how I got involved, 20 years ago, I wrote a book called Raised by Wolves, the story of Christian rock and roll. And you're right, I am sort of one of the obsessive I guess the nice word for it is historian. OCD comes to mind if somebody's being a little bit more honest about it. But I've been collecting this music and obsessing over it for a long time. And the truth is, Malcolm Gladwell, who's an author and a speaker, he kind of dismantles this concept of genius, and he breaks it down and says, really, maybe there's no such thing as genius, but certain people have a combination of aptitude for a certain thing, they have access to that thing, and then they have a willingness to put in a lot of hours on that thing. And so that's what separates the Michael Jordans from the rest of the basketball players, or that's what separates the Michael Jacksons from the rest of the pop stars. And when it comes to this world of music and thinking about music deeply, and especially the intersection of faith and spirituality and how that interacts with music, I happen to have access to it because I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago near where Jesus People USA was, and they're the people that put on the Cornerstone Festival.
Yeah.
I also was in earshot of a radio station called WCRM that happened to have a very eclectic playlist, and they played rock and alternative music when most Christian radio never would do that, every night from 9 to midnight, and on Saturday nights even more. So I had access to music like that. I held Christian bookstores in Chicago, especially Wheaton and Lombard and Glen Ellen and all around that area. They had a much wider selection of hard-to-find music than most cities around the country. So I had access. I also had access to people, experts, that took me under their wing and tolerated my obsessiveness. So I had access. I happened to be born or raised in the right town. I had a certain aptitude for both music myself as a musician and an interest in this stuff, but I also have an ability to communicate. I can write and I can speak, and so there's a certain sort of innate aptitude. And I have people in my life that just encouraged me to develop those skills. But the other thing that's interesting is I was really sick when I was a kid. I'm physically sick. I had a lot of health problems from the time I was young until I had surgery when I was 17. Which gave me a ton of free time. I would finish all of my schoolwork by about 9 or 10 in the morning and have all these hours to read liner notes on records, write letters to artists, read magazines. I learned how to write about music by reading Rolling Stone and Spin and Alternative Press and different magazines. I read books and books and books about music. I would study lyrics, and so when I saw later on how Malcolm Gladwell broke that down, and he talked about you put in your 10,000 hours to become an expert, I was like, oh boy, I put in way more than 10,000 hours. And so I just became an expert on a very obscure thing. That's just, and for many, many years, I've wondered if that was really even smart, because even in the world of Christian music, the kind of music that I really have most loved has been the really old stuff. I'm talking going back to Sister Rosetta Tharpe in the 50s. She's really the one that innovated this idea of not only of just Christian rock, but rock and roll in general. Was an African-American woman with an electric guitar inventing rock and roll in the church. That's Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And when I discovered her as a teenager, I thought, oh my goodness, this is the fountainhead from which all this stuff, that is exciting. Johnny Cash is exciting. Gospel music has always been exciting to me. And then hearing that strain, but a lot of, no offense, but mainstream CCM, has never been my main thing. And yet I spent 10 years working at Capital Christian Music Group and EMI, working in publishing and working with songwriters and learning that aspect as well. So I also ended up having access there, and I learned how to do music supervision and working with films, worked on 10 or 12 movies, including things like Grace Unplugged that some of your listeners would have heard, and then another movie called Electric Jesus that's more of a mainstream film about a Christian metal band that's also coming out this fall. So I learned how to do music supervision. I learned how to work in films. And then right now, this fall, there's 2 films. One, a true documentary about the roots of Christian music back in the Jesus movement, which I happen to have written a book about. So they called me and said, hey, we've been using your book as a reference as we're writing this thing. Could we interview you for this? And when they talked to me for the interview, after the first interview, they said, hey, would you come back? Could we talk to you more? And so they did, 8-9 hours of interviews with me. And I think that they just liked how I spoke. They liked my perspective on it. And I think I offered a slightly different edge compared to maybe the other people that they were talking to. And it was it was what they wanted. I've ended up helping them think through the storyline a little bit, and even off screen there's more ways that I helped them with it. But what it is, the Jesus music is essentially a distilled version of their original vision, which was to make an episodic multi-part series about the history of Christian music. They ended up having this chance to do a theatrical release to compile it all down into an hour and a half, 2 hour long feature film. And so it unpacks the Jesus movement that happened in the late 60s and early 70s, kind of places the genesis of what we now call CCM back at that moment. It shows with a lot of archival footage the birth of this genre, and then traces it through the 70s and into the 80s and into the 90s a little bit, and then today. And really kind of focusing, because you can't tell the whole story. They have hundreds of hours of footage and interviews that hopefully will be used in future projects. But for this, they focused on the stories of Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, Toby Mac, Michael Sweet from Stryper, which is an interesting kind of left turn for this, and Kirk Franklin. And they become the main stories. But then you've got Glenn Kaiser and other historians and kind of perspectives. You've got the guys from Chuck Girard and people from Love Song, and they have spent a good amount of time in the 70s talking about those roots. And then, Amy's story really does anchor this, and I don't want to give too much away, but they do spend a lot of time with her, and then it kind of traces it through to today. And I think it kind of frames the way Christian music is now, and they show a lot of the faces of today's Christian artists. And you might hear a few words from a Lauren Daigle or David Crowder or some of these current artists, and just enough to make you want to lean in more and hopefully hear more from them down the road, and kind of ask some questions about the difference between Jesus music in the early days and contemporary Christian music. Like, what was the shift, and what is the difference between Jesus music and CCM? And is modern worship really a return to Jesus music, or is it something different? And I think it asks, or at least invites people to consider some of those questions in a pretty fun way. But in a lot of ways, it just it's going to be an introduction to a lot of Christian music fans of where this music even came from. And if it's nothing other than that, then it's probably a good thing.
And that's what I liked with the 30-minute or so that I got to see in June. By the way, the website is jesusmusic.movie if you want to see what we're talking about. I loved it because I looked at it like, for those of us that are geeks that have loved Christian music for decades, it was so fun to relive some of that and even learn before I had gotten into Christian music, like the 70s, the history. But if somebody's listening like, I'm new to Christian music, this is a great movie for you to experience the history of Christian music and see where it's going and what is happening. And I love that you said that, John, that it poses questions, because anytime we can watch something that brings up our own thoughts and thought-provoking, I think is a win, right? I think
so, right.
I'm looking forward to hearing more history of Toby Mac, Michael W. Smith, Amy Grant, Kirk Franklin. And I was a Stryper fan like you back in the 80s and the day. And they're still putting out music today. But wow, I can't.
Oh, man, some of their best stuff.
Right. Yeah. I can't wait to hear some of that. And you brought up a little bit about Electric Jesus. And I know that's based on a fictional story, but when does that take place in the movie? It takes place in the 80s, right?
Yeah, 1986. So Electric Jesus is they jokingly call it a 80s hair band romantic comedy, so that it is about a Christian heavy metal band in 1986. It's an imagined story, but it's very anchored in the world that the writer and director Chris White grew up in South Carolina in the 80s, going to youth group, listening to Christian rock. So he created that world based out of his real experience, and then I got to help him kind of populate it and make it feel very authentic, because I was actually in rock bands,
right,
and, Christian bands in the 80s, as a kid. And so you find this story of these kids who go on tour in the summer of 86, and they play skating rinks and youth camps and churches where people look at them sideways, and then they get an opportunity, and boy, if they can just make it out to Texas for one big show, and if they rock that show really well, but it's in a real rock club, like it's not a church gig, but if they do well, they're going to get a chance to open up for Stryper and Motley Crue on the Heaven and Hell tour. So the big question is, like, are they going to make it? Is this going to be their big shot? And what's going to happen? And that's the then there's a very chaste, sweet romance that happens along the way. And again, like every great story, I think that it asks some really, really good questions because it's kind of silly, and there's a lot of humor in it, and there's stuff that you go, oh my gosh, we left those costumes behind. Like, fortunately, we don't dress like that anymore. It's the 80s, right? And some of the music even, we're like, oh, we haven't listened to that in a while. But a lot of people have even left the church culture that dominated their life in the 80s. They've left that behind. Some people have even left their faith behind. And so this movie, I think, asks some questions about some of what we've left behind should we have kept, and is some of the stuff that we've kept things that we should have left behind, and where are those lines? And so I think that even for a comedy, it's actually much more thoughtful and emotional than people expect. And I've sat and watched it with people. In fact, I watched it with Dan Hasseltine from Jars of Clay recently. He came over to the house and watched it with me, and he was not expecting how emotional it was at the end, and that was very, very rewarding.
I have to tell you, I screened it, and I wasn't expecting how emotional it got in the end, but I love because it left me with a thought-provoking moment and a deep moment. Yeah. And knowing you and I know some that were Christian musicians that had walked away from the faith, and some that have really come on strong, and Jesus is still the center. So I found it very thought-provoking, and thinking sometimes you hear the word phase. Like some think it was a Christian music, or Jesus thing was a phase. And I'm so glad that for me and for you, it wasn't a phase. It's a very real thing, because it wasn't about that experience with the music. It was about that experience with a living, breathing Savior that loves us and that wants to see our lives change. And music just happens to be the vehicle in which I think there's ways we get encouraged. And I think Christian music is an effective tool for those that are following Jesus, because it brings encouragement, and it can be a great outreach tool. I mean, look at me. I heard a song. I know it was on a mainstream station. It was Amy Grant. It was very controversial back in the 80s, apparently, when she went secular, and I didn't know what that word meant. But when I heard that song...
It doesn't mean anything, by the way. There's no such thing as secular. It doesn't exist.
I know. I'm like, Seca what? But it was about...
It doesn't exist.
About 86. And I remember just thinking, why am I crying hearing the song Love Will Find a Way? My life was a hot mess at 17, but it was God. He was using that music. And I remember somebody took me to Amy Grant Unguarded tour. I didn't know this person well. It was a friend of my mom's. And when we went to that concert, I thought, what did these people here know about this God that Amy's talking about? Just enough. She didn't say too much where I would have tuned out. She said just enough about God that I remember thinking, there's a God that's personal, that wants to, I want to know more about this. But I'll never forget, and you'll laugh at this, John. There was this amazing artist, Rich Mullins, iconic, legendary songwriter, and he happened to be at the show opening. And I remember reading this shirt, and it was a song of his, and I did not know what it means, and I was not going to ask this woman I didn't know, but it said, live like you'll leave tomorrow, die knowing you'll live forever. And I just stared at it like, what in the world does this mean? And that's when I came home, and I had to listen to all these old Amy Grant things, and then God led me to meet you, and I was so thankful for Christian music because it brought so much encouragement to me. And I think what you're talking about earlier, even with True Tunes, Christian music, it brought community for me. I had a common interest and a common place to talk about God, and some songs that really got me thinking about God on a deeper level. And I made it for what it was. It was a song that somebody wrote from their heart that really just got me to be thinking about God more than I was, you know?
Yeah, I don't know if you had a chance to... Yeah, I don't know if you had a chance. I actually had Amy on the True Tunes podcast recently, And we had a show with Rich Mullins based on an interview that I did at the old True Tune store and then lost and found the tape and restored the tape. And so nobody had ever heard that interview, including me, until recently. And that was something else to hear a 23-year-old version of myself interviewing Rich Mullins, and then a couple episodes later be talking to Amy about some of that very stuff. And we even actually referenced that song. We have a quote, "Leave behind your doubt, love's the only out, love will surely find a way," is in Electric Jesus when one of the characters kind of quotes that. And you're right that sometimes it's better to just leave a little hint of something and leave people wanting more and pull them in, have them kind of lean into a story and wonder, as opposed to the more traditional evangelical approach, which has been, I'm going to blast everybody with the entire story and hope that they receive it. But a lot of times they're not ready for that whole, it doesn't make any, like you're saying, the t-shirt made no sense to you. But Amy planted a seed and then you followed up on that, and that pulled you in. And I think that the Electric Jesus story demonstrates that in a way, but also the Jesus Music film shows the difference when a bunch of hippies in the 60s who had been dropping acid and smoking pot and doing the counterculture thing. The Vietnam War was raging. Basically, the American dream was falling apart at the seams. Everything was the hippie culture was kind of calling a hard foul on the baby boomers, or I guess they were the baby boomers. They were calling a hard foul on the pursuit of happiness and saying this is not right. Permanent war and consumerism and all this stuff is not working. And so they were trying drugs and free sex and all of that. And then a big chunk of them were saying, you know what, this isn't working either. And so when a handful of them started to say, but what about Jesus? And not this religious starched collar business suit Jesus, but this long-haired sandal-wearing countercultural Jesus that asks you to forgive your enemies and lay down your life for your friends and walk on the water and, give up your 5 loaves and your fishes. Like that version of Jesus turns out resonated powerfully with that generation. And a lot of those early Jesus Music songs were really, really simple ideas that these songwriters just said, you know what, I'm just going to share the little bit that I know. I don't have it all figured out, but I'm going to share the little bit I know in a very simple way. And one week they were writing a song about their car or surfing, and the next week they're writing a song about their new faith. And then later it becomes an industry. Later it becomes a genre that has certain expectations attached to it, and the market kind of expects certain things. It becomes more sophisticated, and that's normal. That's kind of how markets evolve. But I think that it is interesting to go back and see the kids in the 60s and early 70s responding to that, and then look at the division and the strife and the weirdness going on, especially in the Christian culture right now, and say, boy, could we use a new Jesus movement? Is it time for and maybe music could help lead the way by young people just penning some new songs that strip away all of the religious artifact. Maybe maybe this time it's not about getting Jesus out of the business suit. Maybe it's getting Jesus out of the political t-shirt and ball cap. Yeah. Maybe it's getting Jesus out of the car, and maybe it's getting, but somehow do we need another movement that takes the gospel out of the cultural box that we've locked it into and says, you know what, Jesus is bigger than that. Gospel of grace and love is much more powerful than the ways we limit it. And the beautiful thing about music and art is that it can soften our hearts and make us receptive, so that when we hear those seeds, it's like the seed has some place to take purchase in the soil in our heart, and it can grow. Whereas we need that preparation. Otherwise, it's like the seeds that fall on the rocky soil, and or the birds just pick it up and take it away. So I really am still committed to this idea. That's our slogan with the new True Tunes, with the podcast and everything, is listen to better music and listen to music better. That second part is let's listen thoughtfully and carefully, whether it's music that's coming from the Christian space or coming from the mainstream world. It's like, let's just listen carefully, because I think music can really be a training ground to help us be better discerners in general. And it's always been that way for me.
That's really good. And I love that I had that experience with working at True Tunes with you for, I don't know, close to 10 years. What an amazing time. I felt like I was in school to learn about Christian music. It really was.
We all were, right? That was our master's program.
Right. And I never,
we just didn't get a diploma.
Right. And I never...
I'll give you one, and you give
do.
me one.
Yeah, let's do that, John. It sounds like a plan. But then to move to the radio side that I never thought I was going to do, but you never know. You just never know where God is going to lead you and where he's going to take you. And I have to say, in my 25 years or so doing this side, Christian radio, I've been just amazed, though, to see the emails that come in to songs and how God uses a song. Like he changed my life. Even, in the Christian community, wow, this song really spoke to me. I needed to hear this song at that time. Or, I was just reading a letter from a mom that said, because of the station I, work for at WBGL, said, thanks to you guys and the music you play, I'm no longer a meth addict. God did that. It wasn't anything we did. It was God used it to speak through the music and the words that were being shared. So music to me, and I know to you, John, we both agree on that, it's such a powerful force. And God uses it in such amazing ways. And I love what you were saying with the True Tunes, saying to listen better. Say that saying again.
Right. Listen to better music and listen to music better. I think
I love it.
We often, for one thing, we just listen to whatever. Sometimes I think that we just listen to whatever's put in front of us, and it's almost like we eating whatever food you just found on the ground. It's like sometimes we need to be more discerning, and I know that at True Tunes we used to have people that would come in and say, is this Christian? And we'd be like, what do you mean? I don't know what that means. We never had, we like when I was teasing you about saying secular doesn't exist, I've always said, I don't believe in secular music. I don't believe it exists. I think that all music is spiritual. The question is just what spirit is driving it. And is it good and true and beautiful, or is it bad and false and ugly? And so all truth is God's truth. And so I think that if something is good and true and beautiful, whether it comes specifically from a Christian source, if it is truly good, it comes from God, and it can in its own way draw us back to an appreciation of that good source. And so we had a different way, but I think that partly came from the fact that we were you and I and most of our staff were not coming from a really strict religious background. I grew up in the Episcopal Church and kind of had this hippie Jesus movement background with my mom's influence and stuff. And most of us just didn't have this really hyper fundamentalist strict background. So we were a little bit more open to stuff. So artists came, we were interested in the music itself, and we would listen to the music. And so some people were coming in, though, and they just wanted to know, is it on a Christian record company? Is it called Christian music?
Right.
And we said, well, I think our job is to discern, is it good? Is it true? Is it beautiful? And so that's the listen to good music, or listen to better music. And then listen to music better is that it's just not a passive activity all the time. Now, sometimes if you're just working and you need something in the background, that's fine. But the exciting thing is when you actually listen deeply. What is the music telling you emotionally, sonically? What is it telling you lyrically? And when we learn how to listen better, we learn how to listen to stuff we haven't heard before, how to appreciate genres that we haven't. We need coaches to help us do that. And I love being a coach, and I love being coached. I love it when someone can help me learn how to like something I've not understood before. And I absolutely I work as the Associate Dean of the School of Music and Worship Arts at Trevecca University here in Nashville, and have for a number of years. I love working with college students who are coming and sitting in my office and saying, okay, I got a bunch of vinyl records in my office and a record player, and I'll pull out a record and say, okay, you've got to hear this, and they want me to help them be better listeners. And in an era where music is largely perceived as being free, and most people are listening to it on tiny little speakers or earbuds, it sonically doesn't sound very good, or they're listening to it while they're doing something else. Sometimes what we have to do is inspire people to take time to actually just listen to music. Just put it on and don't do anything else while you're listening to it. Listen and appreciate music like we used to do when we were kids, which now we sound like old people, but put a record on, and just look at the packaging, or just look at your ceiling or close your eyes and just listen to it. and listen better. Listen to the emotions going on. Listen to and develop empathy. Allow the music to help you become a more empathic person. Roger Ebert, Chicago guy, said movies were machines that generated empathy. The best films were empathy machines. You know, they helped us develop empathy for other people in different situations than us. And I think that's absolutely true. I think music can do the same thing. But a lot of times we're not using it well. We're just using it as background. Or worse, it's just selling us something. It's like a jingle that's selling us a cheeseburger that we don't need. You know? Right. And that goes for Christian music too. So I think that if we can fall in love with the mystical, spiritual power of music and realize God gave us this stuff, and then we can open our hearts to that and to becoming empathic and passionate about the power of music again. What it'll do is it'll kind of break our hearts a little bit more for our neighbor, and it'll make us better people. Right. I don't think that this listen to better music and listen to music better is just in and of itself. It's not an end game. It's actually a beginning, because I think that this whole thing it's like a sandbox that we get to play in, and we develop skills that help us become better human beings, because we're going to develop better discernment skills and better empathy skills, so that we can go be better neighbors. And then when nonsense comes down the pike, when people start saying stuff that's false, that's not true, that's hateful, that's ugly, music might actually be part of the process that helps us discern that, so that we can spit out those bones when they come, and we can go, that's not the gospel, that's not truth, that's not love, that's not
Jesus.
It might be, that's not Jesus. And boy, does the church need more of that right now.
Amen to that. Wow, John, this has been such a great conversation. I love talking about music, and I'm so excited about my friends that are listening that are going to be able to experience maybe some of the history of Christian music, maybe even for the first time, that you lived and that I got to start to live in the 80s. And it's JesusMusic.movie. I can't wait for you to learn more of that history. And I love what John was talking about, because I feel just talking about the appreciation for music, when we can appreciate even the roots and the history of where Christian music came from, and kind of have a feel of where it was rooted and where is it going, I think there's something that's going to happen that's just going to bring us a better connect to the very music that we listen to now and that we love. John, thank you so much for coming on the show. My guest has been John J Thompson. I just have loved our conversation, John. We got to do this again, okay?
All right. Thanks, Weez.